Many times Christians look into how a child of God should deal with sin. Like how John said that we shouldn't sin, yet when we do sin, we have an advocate with the Father. Well, that's dealing with sin after it has happened, not in a very specific way, but just the concept of what do I do after I've sinned? How do I handle sin? Well, if we acknowledge the sin and confess that sin and forsake it, then God blots it out. 1 John 1:9 and Proverbs 26:13 even, Acts 3:19, Acts 8:22. But what about the question of how to avoid sin in terms of preventing the sin before I commit it? Do we ever look into that? It's one thing to look into how to avoid sin after we've committed, or what to do about sin after we've committed the sin. Or we might look at how to avoid sin after we're tempted. Like 1 Corinthians 10:31, for instance, where Paul said, God won't allow you to be tempted greater than you're able to bear. Well, even that concept, whereas John talked about what to do about sin after you've sinned, Paul there in 1 Corinthians 10 talks about what to do to avoid sin before you commit the sin. And James confronted readers, about how if you resist the devil, he'll flee from us. This is good advice as far as how to avoid sin once temptation presents itself. However, what about taking that another step farther, what about avoiding temptation? Is there any way that I can avoid temptation altogether? Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by altogether. As Jesus said in Luke 17, temptation to sin is going to happen, period. However, is there a way to avoid temptation, or at least some temptation? Well, I think there is. I think the Scriptures would help us determine that. But first, as I often prefer to do, we need to answer the question, what is temptation? What is temptation in the first place? How can I avoid temptation if I don't know what temptation is? Well, temptation, I think a good definition of temptation is in James chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. James said, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, or by God. For God tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured by his own desire and enticed. There's temptation, a definition of temptation. It's when you're lured. Temptation occurs when a person is lured by his own desire and enticed. In other words, temptation occurs when a person wants to do something that's contrary to God's will. That is what a temptation is. We use that term for many different things in life. I'm tempted to have that second piece of cake, or I'm tempted to do things that may not really be a matter of sinfulness. But really, spiritually speaking, technically speaking, temptation occurs when somebody wants to do something that is against God's will. When they want to do that thing. Now, when you do the thing, James will say a couple verses later, or the next verse, that's sin. When you want to do the thing, that's temptation. That is what temptation is. I want to do this thing that God's will condemns. That's a temptation. Is there any way to avoid sin by avoiding temptation? Obviously, it is good to avoid sin, and a good way to avoid sin is to be strong enough in the face of temptation. But what will be even more effective in avoiding sin is if I can prevent temptation. That's the best way. So is there any way to do that? Or should we just take Jesus' words in Luke 17 as a way of saying, well, no point trying. And temptations to sin are sure to come. So why try to make it otherwise? Well, because there is some way. There are some things that we can do, steps that we can take, not different things necessarily, but there are steps that we can take in the aim of avoiding temptation in our lives. Some of them, or maybe even most of them. The first step, I would say, is very straightforward. You have to care. The very first thing that a person has to do, if they are to have any hope of avoiding temptation, is care. You got to care about it. If you don't care about it, that is, if you don't have the desire to avoid sin, you're not going to be able to avoid temptation, because you're going to just go through your life without any thought. No care, carelessly. Genesis 39, 8 and 9, talking about Joseph. Joseph refused when his master's wife tempted him. He refused and said, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" There's a man that cared. He cared in general. I do not want to sin against my God. And that was his mentality. How could I do this thing whenever that thing is sinning against God? Because I don't want to do that. That is what it looks like when a person cares. And the result of that, and this was not a situation where Joseph could have really done anything to prevent that temptation. This was more or less a temptation. This is a good example of what James says, what Peter said the devil does. He walks around, prowls around like a lion, seeking somebody to devour. This temptation in this case, that's what was happening. Joseph didn't put himself in a position of temptation. It came to him. But he cared. And that's the first step. Romans 14. In Romans 14, Paul laments his own spiritual pitfalls, his own spiritual weaknesses. And he says, I don't know why I do the things that I do sometimes. And I don't know why I don't do the things that I know I ought to do sometimes. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body? That's a man who cares in general when he's sitting at home by himself with, as far as we're concerned, with not watching the TV, not on your phone or anything, just sitting there. He cared about sin and not doing it. That's the first step. With anything, you got to care. Because if you don't care about it, you're not going to put forth any effort to do it. So number one is cared. Just like Joseph did, just like Paul did. Step two, pray. Jesus said to do this. Despite what man may think about how God does or doesn't help people to avoid temptation, the Lord himself encouraged his disciples to pray to God for help. In his model prayer, Matthew 6:13, hallowed be your name, let your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But remember what he said next? Bring us not into temptation. Well, I thought God doesn't tempt anybody. No, that's not what he's suggested. He's praying to God, help us avoid temptation. Help us to not walk right into temptation. Because we do that a lot. We do it. So sometimes, or all the time, and in general, again, we're not talking about, here's a temptation. We're not talking about Joseph's situation. Here's a temptation. Lord, please help me in this situation. We're talking about before anything ever even comes about. Before the temptation. Lord, please help me to not stumble into temptation stupidly and blindly. Help me avoid. Look, deliver us from some of the older versions. I think the Old King James and the New King James after it says evil. Deliver us from evil. But more strictly with the Greek text, the original text, he says, deliver us from the evil one. Clearly, that's the devil. Who better to be described as the evil one than the devil himself? So, help us not to walk into temptation, and help us deliver us from the devil. If we are delivered from the devil, then we won't have to worry about resisting the devil because we won't face him to begin with. So eventually it's going to happen, but better to take the steps to try to not have to face him at all. Because many times, not every time, but many times, once we face him, we're going to lose. Just like Adam and Eve did. So Jesus says to pray to bring us, to help us to fight temptation. Whoops. Luke 22, in the garden. Remember what he told them? Pray. Now punctuation makes a difference in this verse. And I'm still not convinced which one is more correct. But it may be that there should be a comma after the word pray. And then the rest of that sentence is the reason for praying. Or maybe there shouldn't be a comma, and he's saying pray actually for that thing. But either way, the end result is the same. Pray so that you won't enter into temptation. So what he's either saying just pray, period, and that alone will help you avoid temptation. Or he may be saying, similar to what he said in the model prayer, actually pray that God will help you not enter into temptation. I think they're both true. Like we said, in Matthew 6, he certainly said to pray for it. So either way, in Luke 22, it's the same application. Praying helps you avoid temptation. Psalm 19, verse 13. Psalmist said, in the middle of many other things, keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Now, we might get into a talk about what are presumptuous sins and which sins classify as presumptuous, but in the context here, it seems to me that he's referring to those sins that he does that he doesn't even think about. He just, there are some sins that we do and we know we did them. But I bet there are many more sins than we would like to think that we commit that we don't even realize. We've done it, never crossed our mind, conscience never pricked, we just did it without even realizing that we've sinned. So the psalmist prays, Lord, please protect me, help me to not do those things, even the things I'm unaware of. Protect me from them. He doesn't say forgive me of those, although in his, in spirit, I'm sure that was part of what he had in general in mind, maybe not in that verse. But he's saying, help me not to do them, more of them later in the future. So that's all part of helping me avoid sin. And again, the best way to avoid sin is to avoid temptation altogether. Number 3, think. Think. That may be, again, maybe that's obvious. I'm going to fix this here so that same thing doesn't happen again. Excuse me. Think about it. And the idea here is think ahead. Plan ahead. Think ahead of the time. As we already stated, temptation occurs when a person wants to do things that are contrary to God's will. But this just doesn't happen randomly. Not always. I would argue 9 out of 10 times, or a vast majority of the time, people place themselves in a position that enables them to be tempted into sin. We do it to ourselves many times. If a person really wants to avoid temptation, you got to think ahead. You have to. Because if I am guilty, as most people are, of putting myself, again, you take the example of Joseph, in that particular instance, there was nothing really he could have done. He was sold into slavery. He was serving his master. I mean, what could he have done on that very occasion, that moment, when he was in the room and all of a sudden she made everybody else leave? He's totally ignorant. That was an occasion where it came to him. But there could be somebody who was in the exact position as Joseph who actually put himself in that position. Now, I'm having to deal with the 1 Corinthians 10:31 side of temptation. Now here I am backed into a corner, so to speak, and I'm acting like I'm an innocent bystander? Really? What are you doing there in the first place? You see? With Joseph, he didn't have a choice. But we're not in Joseph's position 9 out of 10 times that we're tempted. We put ourselves there. And in order to not put ourselves there, we got to think ahead. Ephesians 4:26 and 27, Paul said, don't let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. Well, how do I do that, Paul? You think ahead. How do I know whether or not the devil's being given an opportunity? Well, because you do. Where am I putting myself in a place that I shouldn't be, at a time that I shouldn't be there, and with people that I shouldn't be around? Then you've given an opportunity to the devil. Jerry Barber, one of his go-to quotes, always stuck with me. He said, people sin not because they think about sinning, but because they don't think about sinning enough. And his point was this: they don't think about it before. They just don't think at all. It's not that they think about sinning as like, yeah, there's a sin and I can't wait to do it. As soon as I get an opportunity, this sin right here, I'm going to pounce on it. I'm going to do it soon, my first chance. That's not how it works. Usually, people sin because they don't think about it enough. And therefore, they just stumble in, they just walk right into it, walk right into a trap. Whoops, here I am. Now what do I do? Well, can't do anything but do it now, so I'll just do it. I'll ask for forgiveness later. No. Ephesians 4 suggests, even in don't let the sun go down on your anger, that alone is a preparatory. Something's happened, there's anger, think about it beforehand, just take care of it, so you're not later in a situation where the devil has got a prime opportunity to make you sin in your anger. 1 Corinthians 7:5. Husbands and wives even need to take precautions to avoid sins or temptations that are easily preventable. He says, don't deprive one another. Talked about that a few weeks ago on our Wednesday night study in 1 Corinthians. That is a planning ahead, taking a precaution so that Satan won't be able to tempt you. You see, that explicitly says here's a way to try to prevent temptation. It's a precaution. You know what a precaution is? It's what a pre-anything is. It means you do it beforehand. Prepare, precaution. You think about it ahead of time so as to avoid a certain outcome or to try. So taking measures ahead of time. Ephesians 6:10 through 20. The whole armor of God. He says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. When do you put armor on? Literal, actual armor. Well, if you're like me, it's like, I don't ever put armor on. Don't even have any. Well, somebody that does have armor, when do they put it on? You don't put it on after the fight, and you don't put it on during the fight. You put it on before the fight. Or else, you've already lost the fight. Because you can't be putting your armor on while the guy's coming at you. You're goner. You put it on before. So when Paul says, spiritually speaking, put on the whole armor of God, and the aim is to stand against the wiles of the devil, because he is a wily being, you got to be prepared. All these things about the armor of God are things you have to do before you meet him. Think, and that means you got to think. Just like we would plan ahead anything. Okay, we want to, we're trying to achieve this certain result. You know, there are certain things that if we don't take these measures, we're going to get into this situation, like planning a trip ahead of time. When you got to go through a big city, and you want to make sure you don't go through Atlanta, especially, probably the worst city in the country to drive through. You want to make sure you don't, really, Atlanta's maybe a bad example because unless it's 2 in the morning, it's not a good place to drive through. But Nashville, you don't want to be driving through Nashville at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock on a weekday. So you want to plan ahead. We need to leave at this time so that we're getting at Nashville at this time and not at this time. Whereas if you don't think beforehand and then you just leave when you feel like it, may end up, you stop to eat, all of a sudden, guess what? You're sitting on the interstate at rush hour because you didn't think ahead. Spiritually speaking, it's the same thing. You got to think ahead. And this is what I think so many of us fail to do. And that's why we meet a temptation, we concede, we roll over, here it is. When if we would have just, okay, here is something I don't want to do. How can I maybe help myself not do that thing? Maybe I won't go to that party that my friends invited me to. Simple. Even though I'd really like to, it'd probably be a lot of fun. It's either that, I could go and trust myself to be as strong as I can be, or if I'm really serious about it, I can just not go. That is a very legitimate, reasonable, it's a viable option. I cannot go. If nothing else, and in general, the way to avoid temptation, probably putting all things together, you got to fight. You got to put up a fight. Matthew 18, verse 7, Luke 17, 1, like we already referenced. Woe to the world for temptations to sin, because they're sure to come. It's going to come, but you got to fight. Not just after the temptation, but take sin seriously enough that you even put up a fight to avoid temptation by preparing ahead of time, thinking about it. But the good news is that since we're not going to be able to avoid every single instance of temptation, John already gave us some good news when he said, don't sin, but if you do, we have an advocate. Well, that's good news, because I'm not going to be able to avoid every temptation, and every temptation I face, I'm not going to be able to stand up to, and therefore I'm going to sin. Thankfully, in those moments of weakness, I have an advocate. God's made a way. But there's even better news. Since I won't be able to avoid every temptation, once I face the temptation, God still has a lifeline, so to speak. That's what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 10. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. There's number one. He's not trying to downplay the seriousness of your temptations. He's just saying, somebody's been there before. You're not special in the sense of, I can't believe God's tempted me like nobody else. No. You will never be tempted in a way that all people, maybe not every single person, but all people, to one extent or another, will have been tempted. But he says God is faithful. Number two is, He won't let you be tempted beyond what you're able to bear. That is a great comfort. Too many times people take this and they misquote it and say, the Bible says that God won't put anything on your plate at all that you won't be able to bear. That's not true. It's not true that this verse says that, and it's not true at all. Not that God puts those things on your plate, but He doesn't say God won't tempt you beyond your ability, because God doesn't tempt. He says God won't let you be tempted greater than your ability. But what He doesn't say is God won't let you have to deal with something that's greater than you can bear. Because sometimes there are things that we have to bear that are greater than we can handle. Job, if he were here, could tell you all about it. That was a man who certainly had to put up with more than the human soul can tolerate. 10 children, all dead, same day. That alone, you take everything else out of Job's equation, that alone was more than a person can bear. Alone, that is. But what Paul says is God won't let you be tempted. He won't let the devil tempt you. And somebody might say, well, the devil was tempting Job by doing that. It's different. Suffering, trauma, and tragedy is different than temptation to sin. God will not allow you be tempted beyond your ability. Why is that comforting? Because if my precautions have failed and I do, that 1 out of 10 times comes when now I'm where Joseph was. I can take heart knowing, wait a minute, if this temptation is happening, that means I can handle it. And that's empowering. I can not do this sin, even though the temptation is right here. But then the third thing is that in addition to not allowing you to be tempted greater than you can bear, is he also gives you a way of escape. Well, what's a way of escape for? It's whenever you can't. Or at least whenever you feel that you're not able to bear it or to stand up to it, then that's when you need a way of escape. You don't need a way of escape if you can stand up to the devil, and go man to man, and succeed like Jesus did. But you need an escape whenever you can't. See ya, I'm out of here. Joseph, he took the escape, didn't he? I think it's very telling and helpful for a practical illustration to compare Joseph and David, because they were two very similar, not exact, but very similar, practically similar situations, at least in terms of what it looks like to take the way of escape and what it looks like when you don't take the way of escape. David found himself, there's nothing inherently tempting about walking out to your roof or your balcony or whatever in the afternoon or whatever, late morning, whatever it was. But on that occasion, he saw something he shouldn't have been seeing. He could have taken the escape. Now he found himself here. Now what? I can take the way of escape. David did not take the way of escape. He did the total opposite. He looked again. He kept looking, and he even went beyond that. Pursued. Joseph took the way of escape. And you could almost say in Joseph's case, physically speaking, there was no way of escape. He made one. Here's a woman who was there, literally, physically had a hold of his clothes. And that still wasn't enough for Joseph to say, I'm putting up a fight. A lot of men and 17-year-old boys, by the way, in Joseph's position at that point would have been like, okay, I give up. Not Joseph. Paul said this centuries later. Many, many centuries later. But it's almost like Joseph knew this was true about God. There is a way out if you want to take it. And if you can't see it, if you can't find it, you make one of your own. I picture it like, those old Looney Tunes cartoons. And one of the characters runs through a brick wall. And you see their perfect silhouette in the brick wall, where Bugs Bunny or whatever, it's like perfectly Bugs Bunny. Hole in the wall. That's what Joseph did. He shook off his garment and that's what he did. He pulled a Bugs Bunny. That's what we ought to do. But even more than that, we ought to take the precautions so that we're not even in that position. If, as much as is in our power, we can avoid being in that dark room of temptation, can't find the door, and some of those times we may fail to properly look for the escape. It's there. God tells us it's there. Maybe if I can cut down on my instances of temptation, not maybe at all, 100% sure, if I cut down my temptation count, I will have effectively cut down my sin count. Because no matter what percentage of temptations defeat me, if I cut my temptations in half, then that's half at least cut out of my sinning. So put up a fight, not just in the moment, but before the moment. James said, James 4:7, submit yourselves therefore to God. And ironically, it may seem, randomly, he instantly goes into resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Maybe there is a connection between submitting to God and resisting the devil. Obviously, there is. So, submit yourselves to God, and part of that is resist the devil. Here's another great comfort. Yeah, the devil walks around like a roaring lion. He's prowling about, like a cat, like a lion. When they're prowling around, depending on their surroundings at least, they can be pretty clever. Very hard to see. And the prey has no idea they're coming. The devil's like that. You're not going to see him coming. And you're certainly not going to hear him coming. But if you will resist him, he'll flee. Can imagine that. You have the power. You're more powerful than the devil. Because not only can he tempt you with anything that is greater than you can tolerate and defeat, but if you resist him, he'll flee. That's what he did with Jesus, isn't it? He didn't flee forever, but he fled from him in that instance. And every time he resisted him, there he goes. He'll flee. So God, in his word, has plenty to say about how you can be empowered to avoid sin. The best way to avoid sin is to avoid temptation. And the only way to avoid temptation is to care about not sinning, to pray to God for help, to think ahead, and put up a fight. Got to put up a fight. Because if you don't put up a fight, the devil knows you're free game. I know if I approach them or her, he'll roll over. You don't want to be one of those people where you're going to find yourself in a whole lot of temptation and losing the fight. But if I care about it enough to think about it, ask God's help, even beyond that, even beyond what he gives, he'll help. If God won't help you, then Jesus misled us by teaching us to pray for him to help us to avoid temptation. So the fact that Jesus said to pray for that shows that it works. It works. Pray. But again, step one is caring enough, taking sin seriously enough to want to put forth the effort to not create temptations for yourself. We talked this morning about, and last week for that matter, last Sunday afternoon, the concept of providing an occasion of stumbling for somebody. Well, I wonder if that applies to me too. What does that apply if I create an occasion of stumbling for myself? I don't see why it wouldn't. And it may be that I provide occasions of stumbling for no one more than I do for myself. And I'm a soul that God wants to be saved as much as my brother is. So I need to take sin seriously, stop making excuses, and plan ahead to avoid temptation. That's the best way to avoid sin. But what about the things in my life that I have already done? There's always a solution. God's got a solution for everything. When we sin, like John said, we got an advocate. Well, what does that mean? It means for the child of God, when I acknowledge that sin, I pray that God, I repent of it, pray that God will forgive me, he'll do it. Well, what if I've sinned against other people? Well, then you gotta, if you got them involved in the sin somehow, you need to bring them into the repentance too, the correction of the sin. I need to apologize to them, ask their forgiveness, and then, I guess after God's forgiveness, I need to get their forgiveness, or other way around maybe, and make it right. And He will forgive. Pray to the Lord for forgiveness. But then, pray like David did. Now, I've been forgiven of this. Now help me to not be back here again. Help me to not be asking forgiveness for this again by helping me do what I need to do to avoid temptation so I don't need forgiveness. Better to pray for help beforehand than to pray for forgiveness because I didn't pray for help beforehand. It all comes down to the heart and mentality of Paul. Do I care about sinning in my spiritual life enough to make these steps, which requires making sacrifices at times? I'm not going to put myself in those positions. I'm not going to do these things. I'm not going to take part because I don't want to tempt myself to sin. All of this is part of the Christian growth, striving always to better myself in whatever way I can. If anybody needs to respond to the invitation, that's a good place to start. If you need to make it right, then you can start looking forward. Take care of what you've done that's unresolved, then you can strive to move forward and onward.